Now that's selection bias. Let's say you've survived the selection and you've done a good job of selection. Then the next problem you face is information bias. How is information collected from your study subjects? And I want to show you that picture of rural India just to give you this anecdote. So when I was a resident in Vellore, in the first year of my MD training, we were all required to live and work in a village for a few weeks. So we all went, we lived there, we worked there, and we were told to do a survey of all the village households. We would go door to door to each house, each hut with the survey sample questionnaire. The questionnaire would have age, how many people in the house, what is the socioeconomic status, what kind of diet they eat, do they own land or not. That's the kind of standard survey sample. So I was very young and enthusiastic, and I thought, oh, I got this, right? This should be easy peasy. So I charged in with my survey form. One of the first participants I interviewed was a very elderly lady. Okay, her face was all wrinkled, her earrings were dangling to her neck, right? So you could tell that she was an old lady, but I couldn't guess how old she was. So the first survey form was, what's your name? And then the next question is, what's your date of birth? Okay. So I asked her date of birth, and this lady starts laughing at me. She laughed at me on my face and she said, son, in Tamil, she said, son, I have no idea what my date of birth is. And I have no idea what my age is. So you look at this face, she said, and then you make an estimate and you put that in your form that you're filling. And I was absolutely dumbstruck that there were people who absolutely had no idea what their date of birth was. So even age was not a slam dunk variable, right? I mean, that's true even today. A lot of elderly people in villages in India simply do not know their date of birth, nor will have a birth record, and you even cannot estimate their age. So I went running back to my professor, Dr. Mulil, I said, JP, I'm a disaster as a researcher. I can't even get age, forget anything else. He said, son, take me to the household and I'll show you how to do this. So he walked with me to the same woman, and then he sat with me and he started, okay, so were you alive when India attained independence? And the lady said, yeah, I was there. Do you know how old you were when India attained independence? Yeah, I was probably around 10 years old. He used like 8 different ways to triangulate her age based on asking a whole bunch of other questions. And I was like absolutely dumbfounded that you needed a mini questionnaire just to get at age, right? And even that is an approximate. So we have to do all sorts of shenanigans to measure things in real life, right? So if you measure something like sexual behavior, it's fraught with problems, right? Domestic violence. How do you quantify? How do you even ask a woman, has your husband been beating you, right? And what is the social desirability bias, right? Would the woman even tell you what's happening? What if the interviewer is a male? What if the interviewer is someone who's seen with suspicion, right? All sorts of challenges in how we collect information, right? So measurement error is a fact of life, and that's what information bias is all about. Simple things like age cannot be accurately done. Dietary intake. Try getting dietary intake in a survey, right? What did you eat yesterday? I have no idea. Okay. What did you eat last month? I can't tell you. So how do I capture complex information like dietary intake, physical activity, pain, stress, socioeconomic status? I mean, there are textbooks written on how socioeconomic status can be measured, right? Is it education? Is it occupation? Is it income? Is it a prestigious job? It's a whole bunch of things, right? There's a Kupusamy scale. There's 50 different scales for measuring socioeconomic status. Alcohol, sexual behavior, nothing is easy to measure. Everything has measurement error built into it. I mean, look at adherence. Adherence to medicines is far from easy, right? Do you just look at pills? What if I just flushed the pills before I came to see you? Do I measure your blood levels of the drugs, right? How on earth do I actually measure? And turns out there are so many complicated and sophisticated approaches to just measuring a simple variable. What proportion of TB medicines have you taken? Even that is far from simple in a real world study. Okay, self-rated adherence is completely not good enough. Providers saying my patients are taking their medicines, simply not good enough. You got to do better than that if you're doing a serious study on medication adherence, right? Take a look at this study. They just were trying to look at screening cytology slides from pap smears to look at whether HPV virus was positive or not and correlating with cumulative risk of cervical cancer. They did the cytology reading in Brazil, and they did not find a big association between HPV positive women and HPV negative women as far as cervical cancer is concerned. They took the same slides, they shipped it to Montreal, and boom, you see a big difference in HPV positive and HPV negative women because the cytology was read way better than how they read it on the site in Brazil. So the same slide is read by two different trained cytologists, could come up with different answers, right? This is a problem of lack of reproducibility, and this introduces measurement error, right? And turns out that as over a period of history, compared to the 1980s, when PCR tests were not that good for HPV, when they improved the quality of PCR testing, the link between HPV and cervical cancer became stronger and stronger and stronger. Today, it's a rock solid causal association. HPV is causally linked with cervical cancer, and the odds ratio is in the magnitude of more than 100. Okay, that's strong. It is, but it wasn't this strong when the testing was not good. When the testing improved, the association became easier to pick up. So exposures can be misclassified. Every single outcome can be misclassified or measured with error. Tuberculosis in children. Let's say I was doing a study on TB in children. I simply could not come up with an easy way of diagnosing TB in kids. It's a nightmare to diagnose TB in kids. I have to use tuberculin. I have to look for symptoms. I'll do cultures. I have to do multiple different things. Even at the end of it all, I cannot really confirm TB in a whole bunch of kids, right? So TB in children, any study on TB in children is full of misclassification because I never quite can tell who has TB and who doesn't have. COVID, zero prevalence, right? We're still struggling to know, do people really are positive or not, right? Angina, not easy. Try and diagnose depression, dementia, chronic fatigue syndrome. Every one of these can be misclassified, depends on the tool. So information bias by definition is all about bias arising from measurement error, right? Every single tool, questionnaire, test, whatever it is we use in epidemiological research has its inherent measurement error. There is no perfect measurement at all for anything that we do. So there's always noise in our data that comes from misclassification or information bias or measurement bias, okay? So misclassification occurs when the sensitivity and or specificity of the procedure to detect the exposure or the effect is not perfect, okay? So the fact that every tool has its sensitivity and specificity, that we might use multiple tools in a study, means we are always worried how much is the accumulated measurement error in our particular research study, okay? In an ideal world, everybody with COVID-19 will have a certain antibody response in their blood. Everybody without COVID will have no antibodies at all in their blood. And we can beautifully separate these people from each other, right? The two groups will fall apart. We will have zero confusion on who's infected and who's not, right? And an ideal measurement tool will have zero misclassification, which means it will have perfect sensitivity and perfect specificity. Everybody with the disease will have a certain value on the test. Everybody without the disease will have a different value on the test. There will be no overlap between these two groups. And you already know that this is not true. Everything we do in life will have a certain degree of overlap, right? Now you have a distribution of antibodies in the disease or the COVID infected people, and you will have a distribution of antibody levels in the non-infected people, and there will be some people, I guarantee you, which will fall right in between, and you don't know what to do with them. And if I drew a cutoff here, cutoff for the antibody levels, I will surely misclassify some diseased people as being non-diseased, and I will definitely misclassify some non-disease people as having the disease. No matter where I move the cutoff, I'm doing a trade-off, right? Imagine blood pressure in the non-hypertensive group and blood pressure in the hypertensive group. No matter where I draw the cutoff, 140 over 90, systolic and diastolic, I'm invariably misclassifying some people around the cutoff, right? I can shift the cutoff, then I'm also shifting the number of people who are going to get misclassified. So everything in a diagnostic setting is a trade-off. You want to maximize sensitivity, you will take a hit on specificity. You increase specificity, you will take a hit on sensitivity. That's because it's a simple matter of where you draw the cutoff and how many people get moved in this group versus that group. So you can see here in the next slide, here's a nice example of intraocular pressure, right? Disease-free people have a certain intraocular pressure in the eyes, and people with glaucoma have elevated intraocular pressure, and you see the overlap here, right? There will be some disease-free people who will be misclassified as having glaucoma, and the reverse will also be true, right? So that's why, and I promise you, you will get an entire lecture on diagnostic accuracy next week. For now, we construct a diagnostic 2x2 table, people with the disease, people without the disease, people who are positive on the new test, negative on the new test. Cell A, B, C, D are the true positives, false negatives, and true negatives. We go on then to compute two numbers. Among all those with the disease, column 1, this total, how many are detected by the new test, right? This cell A divided by the column total gives you the sensitivity of a test. It's also called a true positive rate. Specificity of a test is among all those without the disease, disease negative, column 2, what proportion were negative on the new test, okay? So that's cell D. Cell D as a percentage of the column total gives you the specificity. Here's an example. Antibody tests for COVID-19, okay? 103 samples from 48 patients with PCR confirmed SARS-CoV infection and 153 control samples from people without SARS-CoV infection. And they did two different serological tests, one by an Abbott company and the other is by another European company. Okay, and here are the results. You can see the Abbott test had a sensitivity of 99%, and the sensitivity of the Abbott test ranged from 0% in the first 3 days, climbed to 30% by 7 days, and about 47% by 14 days. And it's only after 14 days the sensitivity of the Abbott test reached 93%, while the European test had poorer performance than the Abbott test. So if you don't account for this error in your seroprevalence survey for COVID, you will come up with misleading results. So no test here is perfect. You can see that. If you use the European Euroimmune test for your prevalence survey and it has a specificity of only 95, you will end up with a lot of false positive people in your study. Okay, we'll cover that in greater detail. But for now, I just wanted to kind of tell you that every tool that we use in every epidemiological study has its own built-in error, which is the sensitivity and specificity. Okay, blinding is a huge source of misclassification in randomized control trial. I'll give you an example. They did a randomized control trial on vitamin C for common cold. They took people with common cold, randomized them to vitamin C to placebo. Turns out that patients who got the pills crushed them with their teeth. And the minute you crush it, the pill, it takes seconds to spot vitamin C because vitamin C is ascorbic acid, right? It's very easy to taste that you actually have an acid taste in your mouth. So everybody figured out who was on vitamin C versus who was on placebo, right? So this is called accidental unblinding or unmasking during a trial. And the minute people know that they're on vitamin C, they might feel better or they might report lower symptoms compared to those who are on placebo, right? So you do not want this in your study. You want to do the blinding of the intervention so that people who are on the pill and placebo will not know which one they are on, right? That is to make sure we collect information equally between the treatment arm and the placebo arm. In general, blinding is critical when you have soft outpoints, right? Soft endpoints means pain, stress, fatigue, resolution of symptoms, joint stiffness, anything that's soft and subjective, you want to make sure there's blinding. Anything that is a hard endpoint like death or a lab result, blinding is really not big an issue, right? People cannot skew their lab results based on what they're thinking, but what they report to you in terms of quality of life and other things, they can be biased based on whether they think they're on medicine or they think they're on placebo, okay? And then there is something in case control studies, a very pernicious problem called recall bias. So there's a lot of media around MMR vaccine and autism. Okay, much of it is debunked, but still there's a lot of news reports in the early days that MMR vaccination is somehow associated with autism. Now, let's say I was doing a case control study. I picked kids with autism, and I asked the parents, so what did you give to this particular child? Did you give vaccine or not? And then I pick control kids without autism, and I ask about the vaccine history. Now, if the families of kids with autism had already read in the media that MMR might be linked to autism, are they more likely to report that yes, the kid got an MMR vaccine recently? Turns out that that's exactly what they do. So cases might have a differential recall compared to the controls because they know they're a case, the controls know they are controls, and there may be something that tells them to remember or recollect differently. And this is a huge problem in all studies, that case control studies that we do on congenital malformations. When you have a mom who's just delivered a baby with a congenital malformation, she's often ruminating about what she did wrong. She might think she did something wrong. Did I take any medicine when I'm not supposed to? Did I drink when I was not supposed to? Did I smoke? So she might recall at a heightened level because she's worried and she's very stressed and she's thinking. Her recall is very different from a mom who's just delivered a healthy baby, right? That mom may not remember much about what she took or did not drink coffee, or she had this medicine or that medicine. So this differential recall between cases and controls ends up skewing the odds ratio, and we call that recall bias in a case control study, okay? The last couple of slides is basically to say we can try and reduce information bias as much as possible. Use trained interviewers, have standardized questionnaires, use the best possible tool to measure something. Train people and standardize before you collect the information. Use the same questionnaire for the cases and controls, right? Use the same lab test for the cases and controls. And then once you collected all this information, try and come up with analysis of misclassification. If you could even do a small sub-study on how good your test is. For example, I've used the Euroimmune test for the seroprevalence in Santa Clara, and I know what the sensitivity and specificity of that test is from the paper I showed you. I can now go back and correct for the misclassification bias in my prevalence estimate. So we can tackle misclassification bias even at the analytical stage if we knew how good the instrument or the test was that we used in our survey. Okay, now I'll stop here.